What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Any discussion of best decks has to start with the archetype that has been the most revolutionized by the addition of Mr. Fantastic First Steps, and that is, of course, Surfin' USA, which is the new all beef points package iteration of the Surfer deck. Bringing Captain Carter back into the fold is something that has a ton of synergy with the new full buff package that this deck has access to. It also has access to powerful endgame interaction like Juggernaut, surprise cube winners like Copycat or Prodigy if you prefer to go that direction, and generally just a butt ton of power. This is a deck that has, as a baseline, a high level of threat for anyone who wants to experiment, because it will just stat check a lot of experimental decks out of the game. A lot of why I focus on decks like this up front is because they define the rules that everyone else has to adhere to. This is a deck that is defining the rules of the metagame by saying you must be this tall to ride. If you don't have a coherent plan for beating some really big numbers in a bunch of different locations, and that'll be true regardless of what specific Surfer build your opponent is playing, the deck has just hit this critical mass of buffers and buff recipients such that it is almost always going to be doing some ridiculous stuff most of the time. You are just going to be in for a bad time. This is public enemy number one. It is the thing that most people need to be aware of. It is something that you need to have a game plan for if you run into it. If you are looking at a deck that you see on Twitter or YouTube or something like that, you should ask yourself, does this have a game plan for when Surfer just drops a bunch of points on my head? And if the answer is no, you need to seriously evaluate if that deck is worth your time and if that deck is worth the investment that it would take to make it. Right now, this is the deck that sets the bar. In fact, it doesn't just set the bar, it is the bar. Cerebro 3 is another bar setter. And what I mean by that is everything I just said about the way Surfer is constructed is a similar thing you're going to have to think about for Cerebro 3. Now, I do think that the key card in Cerebro decks, weirdly, is Cosmo, because this is what allows the metagame to move from a metagame that was dominated by tech piles to a metagame that is now dominated by this kind of output stuff. The two perhaps most important cards in the metagame right now are Cosmo and Juggernaut. Both of them are really good at protecting your various investments in buffing the other lanes in both of these decks. There are absolutely going to be Surfer decks that run Cosmo, there are absolutely going to be Surfer decks that run Juggernaut, and there are always going to be Cerebro 3s running both. These are the constraints that you have to live within, and these are the things that are making it hard for tech pile decks to pile up the wins the way they previously have. In fact, if you are playing a tech pile, Cerebro 3 is basically the scariest possible thing you can see. Cosmo shuts down the Cerebro, and you literally just don't have other options. It's gotten to the point that I'm playing a teched out Thanos list with a Red Skull in it. When people ask what the Red Skull is for, it's the only actual tech card that works through a Cosmo against Cerebro. That's literally all that it is. It is not even really a good card, it's just like a more active Shang-Chi. Speaking of Shang-Chi, he has hit, in my estimation, a near all-time low, in large part because these two decks are what are defining the metagame right now. Everyone is dodging Shang-Chi, and there's a bunch of Juggernaut and Cosmo, so even if you have it, you're not guaranteed to get any value out of our boy Shanger Banger. This is the largest thing that is driving this metagame to be different from previous metagames. And a lot of it is from Mr. Fantastic, don't get me wrong, but a lot of it is also from Cerebro. There's been a lot of hype around Fantasticar, and I would argue this is one of the more played archetypes in the current iteration of Marvel Snap, and that hype around Fantasticar isn't necessarily unwarranted, it's pretty damn good. I'm not going to sit here and down-talk Fantasticar necessarily, but what I am going to say is I find it hard to believe that this deck has full levels of longevity. It's at where it's at on the tier list right now, largely on play rate. And to be clear, I do think that Professor X's inclusion in this deck is a meaningful upgrade. It provides you not only some protection from Killmonger, but the ability to simplify the game into I won one lane, let me go win the other. That's very powerful in a world where people are playing reactive tech. On the other hand, the best decks in the game, in my opinion, are the ones that have the ability to back buff that Prof X lane, making it not as profitable as you'd like. I also would like to give special mention to Magic here. I am typically not a Magic fan. I'm actually still not a Magic fan. Sorry, Orlando. This is a deck that does want Magic. It really cares about those extra turns. It gets more value out of Fantasticar the more it is able to play cards that are getting buffed by Fantasticar. I do not think it is a coincidence that the top 3 decks that we've talked about are these decks that have these board-wide buffs right now. I also want to point out that in 2 cases, that does create at least a minor vulnerability to the card Shadow King. So what is a poor mid-range pile gamer to do? If you're a mid-range pile gamer and you're suddenly staring at your pile of mid-range cards and realizing, wait, my Shang-Chi has no targets against Cerebro, my Shang-Chi has no targets against Surfer, my Enchantress has no targets against Cerebro. I know you think you're going to hit Cerebro with it, you're just not. My Enchantress has no targets against Surfer. How am I meant to continue to be a tech deck? And I think this is a very clever evolution in the sense of it's less a tech deck and more of a, well, our tech isn't good, let's play the same good card shell, but do different things to shut down our opponents. Legion is obviously incredibly good generally here if you can afford to get him into your list, because there are a lot of great locations that mess up Cerebro gamers and Surfer gamers. Goliath and Cannonball serve as catch-alls, and you still have your typical Gladiator Fenris Wolf package, which does come with a Shang-Chi. Now, the other thing this deck does that I think is pretty notable is bring back Gladiator, and I expect to see a little bit more of that. As the metagame has moved away from big guys and tech answers, Gladiator has gotten significantly better. He's throwing the game a lot less now, and that is absolutely a good reason to start reinvesting in Gladiator stonks, Fenris Wolf stonks, Cannonball stonks, all of that kind of stuff might be better now because of that. Here is the other direction you can go with tech, and this is largely inspired by a list that Crazy was playing. I made a couple of modifications as I played it, and I had a very successful climb with it. You might see a video on it on Tuesday, actually. This list is exactly what you think it is. It is Thanos tech. It is Thanos and every tech card in the game. That's literally all that we're doing. Yes, we are playing a Red Skull instead of a Shang-Chi. That is because I have played effectively 0 good Shang-Chis recently and a lot of good Red Skulls. I did try it with Red Skull and Shang instead of Red Skull and Ench. I think that's perfectly acceptable. Really, the only tech card we're missing is Red Guardian, and I think a lot of the power of this deck is that it just has all of the answers to the questions people are asking. What's really at issue is does it have enough stats to win otherwise? And that's the thing that I keep running into. When this deck is working, you're in a really good spot. When you're able to start rolling downhill and putting stats on the board, then it's really good. But it's important to remember that Red Skull is going to win you 2 lanes by losing 1. And I've run into Cerebro games where my hands were just actually bad enough that Red Skull guaranteed that they didn't have buffs in the 2 side lanes, and I just didn't have enough power to take advantage of it. That is sort of where I am at as far as the Thanos tech archetype. I did really enjoy playing it, and it felt to me like the most coherent version of a tech deck because this is the one that is most customized and updated to what people are actually trying to beat you with. We've entered the Shadow King portion of this discussion. Now, a lot of people are playing Mr. Fantastic. I'm sure you've noticed. You might have written a comment about it already. This is a deck that is trying to punish people for playing Mr. Fantastic. By the way, while I have you here, I know people are going to ask about budget replacements for Mr. Fantastic. The quick rule is, if it is not a buff deck, you can replace Mr. Fantastic with almost any 2. If it is a buff deck, you will find it very difficult to replace Mr. Fantastic. Surge is a perfectly serviceable replacement, but a lot of these decks are predicated on Mr. Fantastic, which means that taking away those buffs is going to be really good. Shadow King is the guy that takes away the buffs. If you can set up situations where Shadow King is playing for 10 to 12 points, that is very difficult for your opponents to deal with. I think that this list is genuinely a little bit underrated now, in large part because of what it does as a Shadow King list. On the downside, though, because there is not a Shadow King for Cerebro, those matchups end up a lot more touch and go. And of course, you are still vulnerable to the Killmonger plays out of something like Cerebro 3. That's a big part of why I still like playing the Infinity Ultron version, which allows you to make some dudes that you can actually count on still being there in a world where Cerebro exists. Eggy Move is in an awkward spot. I've been thinking a lot about trying to get the Alioth back into here as a way of sort of trying to interact with the Cerebro stuff, but it ultimately does sort of become a guessing game against that deck because you are able to go for points in a very real way. This is a powerful list. The numbers it creates are good. The interaction it has is powerful. You'll also notice, as I said, Cosmo in this list. Cosmo and Juggernaut, remember, probably the defining cards of this metagame in the way in which they are pushing against the rising tide of tech that has defined the last few weeks. Mr. Fantastic is in here at the suggestion of Butt. I'm sure it's fine, but this is not a required card for Mr. Fantastic, or Mr. Fantastic is not a required card for this archetype. Fan Fei is what is normally in here. I haven't finished cooking this list, but I'm just trying to figure out what exactly I can do in the Clog space, because it feels like it's so dangerous and so powerful against so many of the decks that we've discussed. Actually being able to clog people is so incredibly important. You have an instant win button in the form of Titania against Cerebro. That's also obviously amazing. Outside of Red Skull, she's kind of the only card that is going to actually win you those games on the spot. Very powerful and incredibly relevant now that the most played Cerebro deck is Cerebro 3. Against Cerebro 2, there's a real risk that the lane gets filled up and you can't send her over. Against Cerebro 3, not so much of a risk. You get to do these sort of snap Titania Goblin plays pretty early, and they're not going to like fill a lane up with something like a Nightcrawler and block it. It's just not going to happen. And that is a free 2 cubes. The rest of this deck, I think, is really up in the air. For example, if you don't have either Surge or Mr. Fantastic, I think Magic is a perfectly acceptable replacement. One of the things that really sticks out when I play this deck is just how much better it is when I have Merlin on 2 than with basically any other 2. Not to say that you're always playing Merlin on 2, I often prioritize Mr. Fantastic or Surge, but just having access to him, knowing that you'll draw him at some point during the game, that's really good. If you want to just ignore the first, 12 minutes of the video where I talk about how all of the tide is being pushed against the tech decks right now and just play a tech deck, I mean, like, this is still probably the tech deck du jour. Like, if we're being honest, I like the Thanos deck more, but this is probably a much easier deck to understand, a much more consistent deck. You are going to get absolutely jacked up by some Cosmos and Alioths and Juggernauts a lot of the time, though. Like, do keep that in mind. It can be hard to play this deck in this environment. You're going to get absolutely jacked up by like Cosmos Cerebro constantly. But again, you do have the ability to beat them when they aren't actually playing these cards. And I think that it is worth talking about this because I think a lot of people look at the metagame and they're like, oh, it's exactly like it was last week. Everyone's playing tech soup. And I really don't think that's true. The thing that has happened to the tech soup decks is the rise of Cosmo, the rise of Alioth, the rise of Juggernaut has made it much harder to actually hit the stuff you want with your tech. And that is really bad for a deck like this because it's not going to be... You don't beat a Cosmo out of Cerebro with this deck. You just literally don't beat it. You do not have the ability. And you very rarely are going to be able to beat like a Juggernaut or a Cosmo out of the Surfer deck either. They just have so many more points than you. And so you end up with like Shadow King probably being your best card, which is a weird change. And you're kind of investing a lot in being able to do this Shang-Chi stuff on the final turn of the game when there's just not anything to hit with him against most decks. It's really notable. This deck got worse, not by virtue of anything it did, but by virtue of everything changing around it. I'm not 100% sold on the list, but I do think that it's very nice that someone is trying out Sandman. This list comes from Ika, and Sandman is obviously a deck that has some real upside, or a card that has some real upside in a bunch of different matchups. The major downside is investing in Sandman in a world where people might Mobius you. That does suck a lot, but it's a way of investing in sort of having extra energy and converting that into a more pronounced advantage. A lot of decks in this metagame really need to play stuff and aren't playing any sixes. So that gives you a pretty large upside when you are able to play a 6, slow them down, Alioth something, play a 1-drop as well. The 1-drop probably came off of Kate Bishop or Merlin. You have a lot going for you. You can also make your Sandman one-sided by including Mobius, and I think that that's actually the bigger draw to me, is just that I want to be playing Mobius against a lot of this stuff. I think that's a very solid thing to do. Having Mobius Sandman, slowing your opponent down, dragging them down with you, and making them sort of, what's the saying? You don't get into a fight with a pig, it'll just drag you down into the mud, and it knows how to fight there. Something like that. I'm pretty sure I butchered it. Ooh, pig, butchered. I'll pretend I did that on purpose. Anyway, this is a list that has, I won't say like has a lot of upside. Like, it is what it is. You know, what you see is what you get here. You're going to be able to play a fairly normal game. You might get jacked up by some Mr. Fantastic stuff. I don't consider him remotely critical to the functioning of this deck. This is very much a deck where you can budget replace Mr. Fantastic with anything. He's just good here. He's here because he's good, and that's kind of it. And that is a totally reasonable deck that you can play right now. Discard is still pretty functional. Like, I don't want to sit here and act like discard is actively bad or anything like that. I actually think it has a pretty solid case to being a very good sort of orthogonal attack the metagame thing. You have some Cosmo issues some of the time, but generally you have the point ceiling to compete with basically anything in the game. And that's a rare thing. Not a lot of decks have that. You also have Bullseye, which can randomly jack up Cerebro decks, and discard, as always, has been sort of a tech victim. So when we talk about the tide moving against the tech decks, that's the kind of thing that discard can be a real beneficiary of. When things start going the other direction, that's really good for a deck like this, which is mostly held back by the death by 1,000 cuts of getting hit by Mobius and Ench and Shang and Shadow King and all of this stuff that doesn't always work, but can work and constrains your play patterns in really real ways. This is a deck that can go head to head with any Mr. Fantastic buff deck and say, I will have more points than you. And it will a decent amount of the time. Your nut draw is that much better than so many other things in the game. There is still the inbuilt inconsistency, but it's a very powerful deck right now, and I would argue kind of a sleeper just by virtue of metagame trends. The same things that are going against Sera are going for this. The world's most boring and generally fine deck, Afflict, is exactly what you think it is. I don't particularly love whipping it out right now, largely because if people are playing Cerebro, they're going to be playing Luke Cage. You literally can't beat that card, but it is, if you're willing to ignore that part of the metagame, the deck's still pretty damn good. This is another deck where when everything is full tech, things can get a little bit awkward, but once you get a little more freedom to start actually executing your game plan, this is the kind of thing that can beat the living crap, for example, out of a Surfer deck. If you want, you can actually replace Mr. Fantastic in here with a Shadow King, and then you really start beating up Surfers. That's a very powerful thing to do. It's definitely non-zero. Now, you are going to still be vulnerable to Cosmo, and maybe you'll lose priority and aren't able to Shadow King the lane you need to Shadow King, but like, it's because of a Juggernaut, I should clarify. It's a legitimate consideration, I think. Like, I think that this is a very strong, and obviously I do like Mr. Fantastic in here, not just because he's good, but because we need all the shots we can get at getting our 4s to cost 3, and he is just an additional chance at that. But Shadow King can also be a very solid budget replacement that attacks a different angle. I don't think this deck is in an amazing spot, and I've played a couple variations of it, one of which, of course, included Cosmo Juggernaut, which obviously is pretty helpful here for protecting all of your BS. But I do think it's a real deck, and I think there's still plenty to be figured out in this space. This is now it's just the most pay-to-win deck of all time. It's a shame I can't get Fantasticar into it, but I think you should pretty well understand what this deck is. You are a little bit worse off based on metagame trends, because not a lot of people are playing the stuff that's like free wins for you in this metagame. Like, you were a deck that was very predicated on, I'm going to beat the crap out of your Shang-Chi deck, right? You're playing like a Scream deck with Shang-Chi in it. You literally can't beat me. You absolutely die. I'm always snapping GG, GG. And we talked about this, like, now we're in sort of a point ceiling metagame where, like, if you don't like have the Shuri Nimrod with your Kid Omega, you can just lose on numbers to whatever is happening right now. Like, there are some like 30-point surfer lanes that you're just like, oh shit, I guess I don't beat that, right? It's not the easiest thing in the world to be a Nimrod gamer, but it is pretty good against anyone who hasn't sort of gotten the news just yet. Mr. Negative is in a bit of a weird spot. It's not that Gore is tiny now, but there are more decks that can go point for point with you when you're not flipping Iron Man and Gore. Your nut draws are still pretty obscene. That's not really in question. But I have seen people going more towards different builds of this list, trying to diversify in an effort to make sure that they have consistent threats coming out of the Mr. Negative shell. I think that this deck has almost disappeared, and it's not necessarily for any fault of its own. It's just things are happening. Some of the Surfer decks are playing Mobius. Most of the Cerebro 3 decks are playing Mobius. That's an instant loss for you to begin with. But even then, Cerebro 3 kind of has like a bunch of cards that don't have on reveals. And how are you supposed to win unless you're flipping an Iron Man and a Mystique, if that's what's happening? And then you might get Juggernaut Cosmo'd against them. It's definitely not the easiest world for a Mr. Negative gamer right now, despite the fact that you'd kind of think it would be. There's enough Mobius and enough things that are just generally decent into you, not good, but just decent enough, that it's hard to go for the risk-reward profile of a deck like this at a time like this. Let's talk about a couple of interesting high infinite performers. This is Derek's Supergiant list, and what it does very well is blow up important things to various game plans. There's a lot of really good stuff being played on 5. Being able to blow it up via Alioth, via Negasonic, is really damn strong. That kind of stuff and the vision afforded to you by Daredevil is what makes this deck such a nightmare matchup for Cerebro. But it's also not a great matchup for all sorts of stuff. Right now, there's a lot of decks that are more than the sum of their parts. And there are decks that are more than the sum of their parts. This kind of deck shows up in order to remove some of those parts so that the deck falls apart. I said part a lot there, but I think you got the idea. We've talked about how good the idea of running Red Skull is, so obviously Surtur is a fairly playable list. This is Zenaid's list. I know people are going to ask, do you need Mr. Fantastic to run this? No, you don't need Mr. Fantastic to run this. He's just good. Like, he's not a required card in any list that isn't buffing a lot of the time. So like the Clog list, it doesn't need Mr. Fantastic. The Thanos list, it doesn't need Mr. Fantastic. This list, it doesn't need Mr. Fantastic. He's just in there because he's good. It's not a hard requirement on any of this stuff, except the stuff that really does care about his buffs. And so I think this list is a good example of what the metagame changing can do for a deck. Because a week ago, this list is so incredibly unplayable. Everyone and their mother is playing all of the tech cards, especially Shang-Chi. He is the one card that is in every deck, and you can't play a list like this in that context. Now, it's changed dramatically thanks to Cosmo Juggernaut packages out of these other decks, and you're benefiting a lot from playing Red Skull because it just absolutely farms Cerebro. I referred to this list as Surtur out of habit. My bad. I don't really know. It's the Surtur archetype, but I guess I need to start calling it tens because now we're playing Surtur without Surtur. I don't like changing my terminology. I can't keep my terminology straight between Alioth and Arishem or Anti-Venom and Agent Venom. And now I gotta actually like keep my terminology straight about the archetype that was previously defined by this card, now not being defined by this card. I don't know. It's a whole thing. The point is, this deck still works. You can take Mr. Fantastic out. You could put Surtur in. You'll be fine. You know what the worst part is I am almost positive I was trying to say Sauron, but I said Surtur instead because I'm bad at fucking names. We've got a butt deck as well. This is, of course, the combo. For any of you unfamiliar, the combo here is blinking M'Baku into some bigger stuff. I think the reason this deck sort of functions right now is because it's a very reasonable ceiling play. It's not like the greatest deck in the world, but it's far from unplayable, and I think it's a good time to remind people that like Marvel Snap decks aren't as far off from being good as you think they are. In many other card games, the gap between an actual deck in the metagame and some garbage is pretty stark. In Marvel Snap, if your deck has a coherent game plan and you can do things that put points on the board, you're always going to be in with a puncher's chance. And I think this is actually a concept that we need a better word for, where it's like, you can put a lot of games to 50-50s and make plays that are otherwise hard for your opponents to deal with just because they don't know where your points are going or because you're creating points in a way they're not expecting. And that's what this deck does. You M'Baku something into something else. M'Baku jumps back out. He's been buffed by a bunch of stuff. But I actually think the important thing here is the Onslaught, because Onslaught is a big force multiplier on what this deck is capable of doing. This is also a deck that plays weird. You're going to be outputting a lot of guys very early and then figuring out what your final turns look like. The dream is being able to Onslaught and Mockingbird on the final turn. Not very likely, but it is within your range. If you aren't doing that, you have M'Baku into at least a 50-50 at Onslaught some of the time, or a 50-50 at the thing that you need, like a Blue Marvel onto that Onslaught lane. All of that stuff also works. This is a deck that, again, I think people tend to think that a quote-unquote bad deck is worse than it is. And I put this on here to point out that this is a very open metagame. This section could be either Cerebro 2 or Cerebro 5. I opted for Cerebro 5 because it's more fun. But I don't want to sit here and act like Cerebro 3 is the only good Cerebro deck because of the effect that Cerebro 3 is having, the Cosmos, the Juggernauts. All the other Cerebro decks are benefiting. It's just that they're a little bit worse into the tech people are actually running. What I like about C5 is mostly that it gets to run actual good cards. A lot of cards in C3, and C2 especially, are fine, but you're running them because of their stat line. Whereas this deck, it's like, wow, these cards are good. These are things I actually want to play. I get to do things that are actually powerful in the game Marvel Snap and also have a Cerebro game plan. Downside, you are so absolutely bereft of location control. Upside, hey, you have enough stats, like 5, like you're not going to lose if you like X-mansion some things. Some X-mansions don't kill you. You have a loot cage for the minus power stuff. Yes, you still die to a bunch of other stuff, but you're not as dead as something like Cerebro 2 to X-mansion or whatever. So I think this deck is very fine. I think Cerebro 2 is very fine. That is a fully constructed deck. And I think if you were looking for potential risers next week, once people start to adjust to what this metagame really is, i.e. not a lot of tech piles, you end up with a metagame that starts benefiting the more all-in versions of Cerebro like C5 and C2, I think. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I have been KMBest. You have been phenomenal, and nothing can change that. Thanks so much. I'll see you in the next one.